Jesus' answer to the suffering paradox from Father John Brown.
We were on this YouTube show the other day on the Atheist Edge.
Yeah.
Do you remember this? Right. So
Yeah.
okay, I don't want to like argue with a guy who's not here to defend himself or anything like that. And he seemed like I got to tell you, he seemed like a very patient and he was listening intently to everything you said and all that kind of stuff. But there's a couple things I kind of wonder how he makes sense of all that. Right. So he says there's a lot of suffering in the world, so I lose my faith because of the suffering in the world. Well, okay, that's absolutely a common reason people lose their faith. Sure. But did you ever notice that the people who are doing the suffering, not just like, hey, there's suffering in the world, but the people who are suffering themselves all turn to God the most, like go to those poor countries, go to those places where there's a terrible disaster. Go to those places where poverty is just so intense that people starve to death. Their faith is often the strongest thing that they have. Like it gives them the will to keep living. And I'm kind of wondering, like, why in the world would it be this way if there weren't something to all of this? It's hard for me to believe that throughout all of human history, it's hard for me to believe that throughout all of civilization, that all of this has been fake. all of this has been some weird, shaman priest who's just manipulated the people into believing a bunch of baloney. It's like I just can't picture how the world gets the way that it gets without it being true, without there being some truth to what we're saying. I'm not saying I've got every single thing perfectly right. I'm open to being corrected on all kind of things I believe, and I'm sure there's some developments in my thought over time that that go one way or the other. But I can't let go of such a basic human phenomenon to be able to say, nope, it's all been an illusion. We're all dust, and to dust we will return, and then that's it. I can't believe that. I can't believe that.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. And I wanted to say, just to support what you said with the suffering and the poor countries and places like that, is I think I might have mentioned this even to Atheist Edge, but if I didn't, I'll say it here. In the Globe study, they looked at 62 different societies, and they found that the ones with the highest levels of humane orientation, which is benevolence and kindness to people and in groups and out groups, are also the ones where there tends to be the most suffering or historical suffering. And the ones with the least amount of suffering historically tend to be the ones with the lowest levels of humane orientation. And the ones with the highest levels of humane orientation also are the biggest believers in God. Like in Africa, it's like 99.9% believe in God. And it's just, and so I back those points completely. I see that just like you.
Yeah, and look through history as well. Like if you want to nail down, okay, there have been like atheists throughout all of history as well, right? There've been non-believers, if you want to call them that, non-conform people who weren't conforming to the going beliefs of the day. All throughout history, there've been like these kind of individuals who kind of stand out for their what we would maybe call atheism today. But atheists or atheism as a kind of like category of people really doesn't come around until I pinpointed it in 1755. The Feast of All Souls Day in Lisbon, Portugal, there's this giant earthquake. And so everybody's in church, right? Everybody's in church, and all these churches come tumbling down on top of them. All the candles in these churches were all burning for all the souls in purgatory. So these candles catch fire to everything. Everybody that survives runs out and runs to the coast, hoping to escape the fires, And I'm sure they were all praying to Saint Christopher to deliver them, And then this big tidal wave comes and just crashes down. And so you just have this massive death moment where all these people die. And so it's not the Portuguese who lost their faith that day. It's everybody else in Europe who looked and said, how can God let such a bad thing happen to all these very religious people? In fact, it's almost like because they were religious, because they were practicing their religion, that they died. I can't believe in God anymore. And so that's really the beginning. I believe that's kind of like the beginning of an atheist classification of people as like a group of people that you could compare to religious people or theists or whatever you want to call it. So that's 1755. There's a whole lot of centuries before that where the dominant sense of humanity was to have a sense of the real that is beyond the material, and that's just I can't get away from that. I can't get away from that.
Yeah, I can't either. And I think that kind of what you're saying is this message that I see when I started studying, especially in the last few months when I came back to Catholicism, I started studying the saints, and I noticed something that was kind of going through a pattern. I noticed that like when we go back to Lourdes and we have Saint Bernadette, And Mother Mary told her she would have to suffer, and it was sort of suffering. The saints are suffering to repair or make reparations
Mhm.
for the sinners. And so, and to me, that's such a difficult concept, but it's something that we consistently see.
Wow.
These saints are suffering. Mother Teresa, my gosh, all the suffering that she did over in India. And so, why do you think that? Why is that system like that? I know it's a really, for
Yeah,
me, it's just
so
a baffling question. It's so hard to think
it's a
about.
big question. And listen, there's a lot of people that have just given up on that concept, right? The prosperity gospel, so there's a lot of people who just say, like, the more you love God, the more he's going to bless your life. And by blessing your life, we mean you'll have enough money for a swimming pool and a 3-car garage and a whatever, right? So there's definitely a lot of people who do not believe what you just said, right? And in fact, I think believers in what you just said, that number of people is shrinking, right? So there are fewer and fewer people who have a good, solid understanding of suffering. So why do I think it's like this? Okay, this is in a nutshell. And anybody in the comment section is free to come at me if they don't, if I skip a few steps in my logic or whatever. But you have people as a people, it's different when you consider individuals. So I would never say one person's sin caused a hurricane or a whatever, but people in general, our lack of unity with God is a problem, right? So God in his perfection and all his goodness, if there's one thing we can, atheists and Christians and everybody can agree on, is that there are things in this world that don't appear to the normal person to be ordered correctly, right? There's sin in the world, there's suffering in the world. Whether you don't like to call it sin or not, everybody agrees there are things in the world that are just no good. And a lot of that is our fault, right? A lot of that is the way we treat one another and the way that the desires that we have. So even the Buddhists will even say this, right? All suffering begins with desire, right? And our desires are disordered. Our desires are all goofed up, right? So here we are, just in the mess we're in. I think that's undeniable, right? That we're in a mess. And then the way that God fixes this mess is without coming in and forcing us all to act the right way, which is the real way to act the right way is to love. And you can't be forced to love, or else it's not love anymore, right? So God, rather than finding some fix that would make us not ourselves anymore, God becomes one of us, right? It's kind of genius, right? He becomes one of us and fills that and sanctifies that by touching all those different parts of what it means to be human, right? For a long time, people believed that if you touched something that was bad, the badness was contagious, and you became unclean if you touched something that was unclean. Well, it really works the opposite way with Christ. He comes in, and because he's so clean, in a sense, because he's so holy, his holiness is contagious, right? So he brings his holiness into humanity. He brings his holiness into the womb. He brings his holiness into a cave. He brings his holiness into a manger. He brings his holiness into childhood and adulthood and working as a carpenter. And he brings his holiness into all these different parts of being human, which include, in the end, very bad suffering and even death itself, right? So I believe this is the way that things are corrected. They're not corrected by saying, I'm going to take it and turn it into something it's not. It's like, I'm going to take it and sanctify those spaces where living in those spaces can be redemptive, right? Can fix the problem. So I think that when we talk about suffering, it's not that we ever sit here and we hope that there's more suffering. What we need is more suffering. Sometimes that's true, right? Sometimes we need suffering to correct us, to correct our attitudes or whatever. We all know that from being a child. If you never correct a child, he'll grow up feral, But there's this other side of us too, that even holy people suffer. And every time I run into somebody who I just know that this person is extremely holy, they've been great sufferers. They've been great sufferers, for the sake of other people, been carrying crosses for the sake of other people. And I think that's it. That's the plan. That's the worldview.